Hi, Misha here, and in my first kind of Star Wars video, we looked at the Incom T-65B X-Wing. You know, the main multi-purpose starfighter of the Rebellion and afterwards. Well, we're not really going to talk about it, we're going to talk about its progenitors. The Z-95, quote-unquote, headhunter, and the ARC-170, aggressive reconnaissance heavy starfighter. So one of these is a light starfighter, the other is a heavy, and of course the X-Wing, which would come later, is right in between. So we thought we'd just talk about these a bit and show off a couple of models from the titanium collection, the titanium series. I think the Z-95 is pretty uncommon, and the ARC-170 is, you can find those. The X-Wing I picked up, it was just a hand, is one of the partisan X-Wings from Rogue One from the Hot Wheels, but it actually scales pretty well with these, so it was easy to hand. I have a few X-Wings. Well, let's talk about the good old Headhunter, a ship that has actually been around longer than you might think. The Headhunter. The Z-95 was a joint development between Incom and Subpro. And this was back well before the Clone Wars, maybe even further back than 32 BBY, so even before Phantom Menace. While it was designed for Republic customers, the Republic didn't have a military as such. So it was mostly targeted at planetary defense and police, kind of anti-piracy. And for its day and time, it was a pretty advanced starfighter, a light starfighter. It's about 11.8 meters long, and it has 4 Incom Mark IIA fusion engines. To compare that to the X-Wing, the X-Wing's about 12.5 meters long and has 4 Mark IVL engines. It actually has the same lasers as the X-Wing, but it only has 2 of them. And the X-Wing has 2 torpedo launchers in the hull that can each hold 3 proton torpedoes, or up to 5 concussion missiles each if modified. The Z-95, on the other hand, has launchers under the wings, and each wing can hold 3 concussion missiles. I don't know if they could be fitted to carry the heavier torpedo or not. In the nose, we have a sensor and targeting package, and we do have life support in the pretty cramped cockpit, and it does not have an astromech droid. That's because originally this did not have hyperdrive. Again, it was kind of for local planetary defense. But later on, an upgrade known as the Z-95T would have an integrated hyperdrive coil system that really helped. It did have shields, although they were relatively light, and it did have hull armor, although again, relatively light. The trade-off is it was quite fast. It could get over 1100 kph in atmosphere, and it was reasonably maneuverable and very advanced, back around 30 BBY. But it was also very modular, which would keep it around for a very long time. And it was affordable at about 80 to 85,000 credits. When the Clone Wars kicked off in 22 BBY with Attack of the Clones, this would be produced by Incom. Now, just before the Clone Wars, Incom and Subpro would part ways, and Incom would purchase full rights to the Z-95. So they would produce a version known as the Clone Z-95 for the Grand Army of the Republic, and these would be used in the war, alongside things like the V-19 Torrent and the later V-Wing. This is when versions like with a hyperdrive would really come around, and it did reasonably well. And kind of put Incom on the map as far as this style of multi-purpose fighter. Now, in the real world, this of course was not seen in Attack of the Clones, but the ship, the Z-95, dates all the way back to 1979, I believe, in some comics, and it was featured in video games in the 80s and 90s, including like X-Wing and TIE Fighter and X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. It's been around a long time. It was also Mara Jade's ship in the Thrawn trilogy. So it's been around a good long while. And it was finally canonized. I can't remember if it was in the Clone Wars or Rebels, but we did finally see it. And it's appeared in a few other things since then. In both Legends and canon, it soldiers on past Yavin, even past Endor, into the New Age, and is still very popular with smugglers and pirates. While the Republic used it, shortly after the Empire came up and the war ended, these were phased out of service because the Empire wasn't really going for possibly hyperdrive equipped ships. By the way, since it doesn't have an astromech, they used either pre-programmed computer chips for the hyperdrive coordinates, or they basically just had to do the calculations manually, or have them transmitted over the HoloNet to the ship. Not ideal, but what are you going to do? Comparing this to the X-Wing, handling-wise, it's not quite as maneuverable or fast. Certainly not as well armed or armored. While the standard version had the two lasers, there was an alternative variant that also had a ion cannon in the nose area in place in some of the sensor and targeting equipment. Again, it was a very modular craft, so lots of versions were created. And while, yeah, production would end after the Clone Wars, since they built so many and spare parts were around, this is one of the earliest starfighters the Rebellion had access to, as did many planetary defense organizations, and for that matter, many pirate organizations. So it was kind of a common sight. And I guess it's kind of like the MiG-21 in our world, where the MiG-21 is still soldiering on, and like the MiG-21, what kept it around were readily available upgrade packages and just an affordable price and easy operation. This ship here, die-cast Toyer model, it has an opening canopy and it has landing gear up or down. And that's about it. Pretty straightforward. It's like an X-Wing without the 4 wings, just the 2. And no R2. So yeah, that was the light fighter. But Incom had ambitions. The ARC-170, I think, is a fan favorite. It first appeared in Revenge of the Sith, what I think most would agree was the best of the prequels. And it, of course, has appeared in the Clone Wars and other things. Now, one criticism is that it's not a very good reconnaissance craft. And that's because the name Aggressive Reconnaissance was just kind of slapped on. The name ARC-170 came first. Originally, this was just called the Clone Fighter. And as is famously known, the kind of genesis of its name was ARC-170 from Ryan Church, which was the concept drawing of this. Well, they just changed that to ARC-170, and boom, the Clone Fighter had a designation. This was developed before the Clone Wars. It was another joint project between Incom and Subpro, and really work was almost completely done when they dissolved the partnership, and presumably, again, Incom purchased full rights to this. So it was just coming online when the Clone Wars began with the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY. And it would serve all the way throughout the Clone Wars, and actually would stick around in the Empire for 5 or 6 years until finally being phased out in favor of more Imperial-esque craft. But of course it would also, like the Z-95, inspire the X-Wing. So what do we have here? Well, this is a pretty big craft for a fighter, but it is a heavy fighter. It's about 14.5 meters long, so a little bit longer than an X-Wing. But where it's a lot larger than an X-Wing is the wingspan, and also just the overall height. And it's just, generally speaking, a heavier craft. But it has a lot going on, because Incom tried to design this to fill several roles. And very unique for the fighters of the day, this does have a integrated hyperdrive, which is a class 1.5, which was exceedingly fast for this day and time. And it has an astromech to calculate the jumps. And it has a crew of 3. It's one of the few true multi-crew fighters in Star Wars. We have, of course, the pilot. Then behind him we have the co-pilot, and both stations pretty much share equipment. They can both fly the craft, they can both fire the guns, they can both operate the sensors, and you can even fly without a co-pilot if you don't need to. He was basically there because this was intended to be a long-range, long-endurance craft. It actually has supplies on board for all 3 for up to 5 days. Now the X-Wing had up to a week, but that was just for one person. And the Z-95 just had a day or 2 for its one person. So 5 days, not bad, and that's just without any resupply. And then in the back, we have a tail gunner and observer. You know, an extra set of eyes in the back. Because in Star Wars, even though we have faster than light travel, they still rely on Mark I eyeballs. Then again, Battlestar Galactica's kind of does the same thing, and yeah. So as far as the armament, the primary are these 2 laser cannons, and if they look big, that's because they definitely are. These are classified as heavy for a fighter, or medium overall. They pack quite a punch. They're intended to be able to punch through the deflector shields of even a capital ship to assault it, or they can pretty much one-shot most any other fighter. But they're relatively slow firing because of their power. In the back, we have 2 more lasers and kind of a turret. And these are light, but very quick firing and adjustable. And of course, that's to defend the rear. The other primary armament, we have half a dozen proton torpedoes. Now, whereas the Z-95 and the X-Wing had 2 launchers, so they could launch 2 at a time, this could only launch 1 at a time. So even though it had 6, a pretty good number for this, it could only launch 1 at a time. So somewhat slow rate of fire. And the reason for it was that while part of the nose area was dedicated for the torpedoes, the other part was dedicated to a very complex suite of instruments. We had long-range scanners and sensors. And we had high-powered jamming equipment that could both be used for offense and defense. And that does kind of give the reconnaissance part of the spacecraft, its name. So it has a lot inside going on. And of course it can land, fly in atmosphere, it can go through space, operate from carriers. As I said in the episode about the Venator Star Destroyer, it usually carried about 36 of these. It was not the slowest thing in the world. It has 2 Incom Mark III engines. And it could get up to about 1,000 kph in atmosphere. But it wasn't terribly agile. It was not all that maneuverable for obvious reasons. So it was fast in a straight line, but maneuverability was less than amazing, as you can understand, which is a good reason for having the tail gunner there. On the other hand, it had very powerful shields and quite thick, durable armor. It could take a few laser hits and keep on going, which is good because it was probably going to take some. In that sense, it's kind of like the later Y-Wing, which would be a few years later during the Clone Wars. But that's a different company. Anywho, they would fly these throughout the Clone Wars. It proved to be quite a good multi-role craft, but it wasn't a great dogfighter. In fact, this was kind of the heavy hitter in an assault wing. It would go after the capital ships or ground targets, and it would be escorted by V-19s or V-Wings or ETA-2s, which could do more of the fighting. And then, like I said, this stayed in the Empire for a few years, longer than a lot of craft, because they didn't have a good replacement for it until things like the TIE bomber came along. So the Empire would pretty much have these phased out a decade before the Battle of Yavin, the destruction of the Death Star. And as you can imagine, many of these would filter to the Rebellion, who, much like what they would do with the Y-Wing, would customize the ARC-170 and fly it. And it was quite prized for its versatility and just durability in general. They even would sometimes use these as light transports because of the extra seats, because they could fly and pick someone up and then fly out. But Incom, for their part, had already moved on to what would become the T-65 X-Wing towards the end of the Clone Wars and immediately after. So while production would continue for a few years, they would pretty much abandon the ARC-170 after the Clone Wars. As far as this model, this is another one from the Titanium. It doesn't really have any moving parts. This does have S-foils, like an X-Wing. These could fold in and out. The in-universe reason is heat dissipation. The real-world reason is it looks cool. It harkens to being the X-Wing. That's what they were going for in Revenge of the Sith, was to kind of have a certain aesthetic. I like this kind of beak nose. Very small canopies, because it had 3 people on board. The downside was there wasn't much space. Pretty cramped cabins there. 3 people and an R2, so, or R4 droid. So total crew of 4, and these could operate independently up to a month if they had supplies, or it could be resupplied. Again, they were meant for long-range tactical missions to go into enemy territory or what have you. Pretty neat, I think. But yeah, the model doesn't really do anything, but it is pretty much all metal. All 6 wings. Only like these cannon. Yeah, those are plastic. Everything else is metal though, which is nice. The Incom ARC-70. Be it my firearms or my real-world aircraft models or fantasy models, Star Trek, Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, I like having collections. I like having series because I like showing progression and just kind of design lineage. When you have a well-developed universe, it's clear, because if you look at real-world aircraft, you can tell usually the company who made it because they just have their own quirks. And you can certainly see the incom here with the wing structure, the nose, the long cannon, and kind of the multi-role facet. Even though this is a light, this is a medium, and this is a heavy, these are all multi-role starfighters to some extent. And they're all hyperdrive capable, at least the Z-95 would soon be. And they all have sensors, and they all have pressurized cockpits. They all have life support. And they were pretty, I say expensive, but they weren't designed to be cheap. They were designed to be effective and durable. The Z-95 was 85,000 credits. The X-Wing was 150,000 credits. And the ARC-170 was 155,000 credits. Mostly because inflation between the two. But I thought I'd just show these. I think that's kind of neat. And they scale quite nicely together. They're not perfect, with the ARC being a little undersized, but that's understandable considering its overall larger size. It's a nice model. And there you have it. So which one do you like? Or do you like the TIE Fighter, which we will get to probably next time. Maybe, if that's what I do. I don't know. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. And I do greatly appreciate you. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.